I felt really honored to be asked to speak on a subject which often is associated with the Global South and not the Global North. And this also gave me opportunity in some of my recent work with UNESCO to share some of the findings that emerged from some of the analysis we did looking at vulnerable and disadvantaged children globally. So one of the things that I would like to bring to our attention is just how important how important it is that we address issues of equity, vulnerability, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. The challenges that face us in society are challenges that cut across cultures and peoples. And we know that governments have been doing a lot to ensure that we have much more cohesive societies where everyone has an opportunity to learn and to be supported. But I think that the global debate on how we help vulnerable people to maximize their potential has often not reflected very much on how we need to rethink the training of teachers, but also the role of teachers in increasing opportunity for vulnerable children. So I think it's a very important subject, and I'm pleased that you are here to share your thoughts and also to hear what I have to say and to have a dialogue on some of the challenges that we face together. I would be drawing quite extensively on my own research and insight of the problems of vulnerable children and how their learning can be improved from a Global South perspective. But like I said, when I was asked to speak on this theme, my team and I started looking at some of the data in the Global North. And I was quite surprised to see just how the problem transcends the poor countries, even into rich countries. So we have a global challenge, and the issue that confronts teachers and classrooms, learners in the South also applies in the North. But I think Europe is at a stage in its own history where we are seeing massive changes in its society. We are all witness to the news about how populations are migrating from the Global South because of wars and famine and other troubles into the Global North. Europe has had a period of where there's a big influx of refugees and people who are coming from the Global South. So I think that the world in which we live in is changing. The classrooms in which we expect the expectations we have of the kind of children that we will be teaching are also changing rapidly. But unfortunately, I think that teachers and the training of teachers has not responded adequately to the challenges. So wherever you look in the data, whether it's in North America, it's in Europe, you can see that the advantaged children from socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds are doing much better, and the gap between their performance in schooling and that of disadvantaged children, that gap is widening. And there has been a lot of policies that have been introduced to address this. But I'm afraid, from my own observation and all my research, that I don't think that we've done enough to tackle the issue about the role of teachers. So I think this is why I think this conference is very, very important. That what is it that we expect teachers to do to respond to this challenge? How should our training be re-engineered to present opportunities, to ensure that opportunities that prevail for advantaged children also exist for disadvantaged children? So let me start by reiterating the point that I've just made. That when we train teachers and when we as teachers move into classrooms, the question that we should be asking ourselves, what kind of children or what kind of environment are we preparing ourselves to enter? I'm afraid that sometimes our teacher education programs have a vision, an image of a classroom that is very different from reality. So you have teachers who have come from backgrounds, often from advantaged backgrounds, being prepared on a curriculum that has an image of a classroom environment which is radically different from what exists on the ground. So it is no wonder that teachers respond in one or two ways. Either they concentrate on those they have been trained to relate to and ignore those they are not familiar with, or they move into schools or environments where they feel that they can do a better job based on their training. I would like to submit that the environment of the classroom that we are training our teachers to in Europe is changed radically and dramatically. And Belgium is one country where the change is very significant, as was pointed out in the introduction, and as I'll be showing from some of the data that I'll be sharing with you. What this means is that the methods that we have used to train teachers, but also the methods that teachers use to teach, need also to go change or reform. And one of the things I've been looking at in my own research is what kind of pedagogy, what kind of teachers do we need to be able to respond to the learning needs of those who are disadvantaged? And the more I look at it, the more I realize also from research that actually a lot of the models that we have actually disadvantages the children who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. So schooling can be an environment where children who are disadvantaged, their needs are addressed. Or schooling can be an environment where those disadvantages are reinforced for vulnerable children. And unfortunately, the reinforcement is what happens, it's what a lot of children experience, especially children from poor backgrounds, children who are from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think what kind of classroom am I talking about? I'm talking about a classroom where the children have coming from different cultures, the languages they may have are different, their abilities may be different, their characteristics are different. And we have a teacher who is confronted with this variable range of abilities, cultures, and is expected to respond to that. And I think we need to recognize that this is going to have a huge impact on the effectiveness of teachers in promoting learning. And we'll talk more about what this means in specific terms as we go on. I'd like to also share some of the, just before I came, I had a look at the PISA 2015 data and did a very rough analysis and a representation of this data. One of the things you see is a variation on the prevalence of migration across EU countries. It's not surprising because we also know that recently this is a phenomenon that has been taking place. If you look at first and second generation migrants, I think they tell an interesting story. If you want to measure how well your education system is responding to vulnerability, I think you have to look at how it responds to people from different cultures, different societies, and how well it's able to meet their learning needs. And whether over time the education system is able to bring them to the level at which they become properly and suitably integrated in Belgian society or in European society. And that is very important because a lot of the alienation, the lack of skills, the inability for young people to find jobs, to be productive members of society, boils back to how the society responds to their needs and meets those and helps them to acquire skills for productive life. If you look at this representation here on, what you see is quite interestingly, Belgium, if you look at the first generation and second generation, it's among the highest, about 17%. So it is quite a high proportion of migrants, let alone, if you put the migrants aside, let alone native people who are also from a disadvantaged background. So I'm using the migrant as an illustration. But within the population, you also have people who are disadvantaged, who are not in this graph. But this is a stark reality, a presentation of what really is happening. one would expect that with time, the first generation migrants would maybe because they are struggling to adjust, settle in society, would have the biggest disadvantage. And then as time goes on, the second generation would do better. But unfortunately, this doesn't happen, which suggests that actually the system is not responding well to addressing the learning needs of generations that come after the first generation. So this is to reiterate the point I've been making, that the schools in Europe are going to become more socially, economically, and ethnically diverse. What that means is that classrooms and instructional relationships would also become more challenging grounds. The classrooms that teachers are going to are much more challenging than when we were in school, than when you were in school. The assumptions that teachers had to make about the children they are going to teach would have to change, because the children that they are confronted with are very different. So the classrooms are quite challenging, and I think that it means we need to have a different response, a different type of teacher, a different type of training to respond to that kind of environment. So as this quote, as Gardner says, it places constraints on teachers' pedagogical choices. So what it means is that when you're confronted with a classroom where you have very diverse populations or diverse children, what kind of pedagogical strategies do you use? A lot of the strategies we use have been developed in response to a homogeneous culture with making certain assumptions about how people learn, about their language capacity, about their home backgrounds. So some of that would not work for others. Okay? And this is what makes it much more challenging for teachers, because then they have to make choices. And the choices that they make may disadvantage others and provide opportunity for other children. So I think this is a reality, and more so in Belgium. I think that this reality is if not addressed, I think would begin to shape Belgian society. These are people who would continue to live in this society, would not have the skills that will allow them to compete for the opportunities within the society. And the consequences that this has for social cohesion, has for community integration is huge. So I think as educators, we do have a big responsibility in addressing this challenge. So I also looked at some of the TALIS OECD data, and I think it's important to understand who are the teachers who teach the disadvantaged. Who are these people? And what you find is that in some countries, actually, you have more experienced teachers, and in this graph, the more experienced teachers are teachers who have had more, about 5 years and above. So it's not a lot of experience, but that's the cutoff point. More experienced teachers are more likely to be working in more challenging schools than in less challenging schools, and Brazil is an example. When we looked at some of the data in UNESCO, one of the things we found was that in some countries, there have been policies which ensure that experienced and good teachers or highly experienced teachers are served in disadvantaged schools. There's a system in place that rotates teachers. I think South Korea was one of those countries we saw where there's an opportunity for teachers to move around so that the experienced teachers, the disadvantaged schools also have opportunity to experience or be taught by experienced teachers. This is a deliberate policy to ensure that there's equitable access to very experienced teachers. I don't know what the policy is in Belgium, but I think sometimes we need to take really drastic action. But what I'm going to propose in my talk later on is a little bit different from that, from simply rotating teachers, because I think there are issues around how you actually do that. But the point about this is that in most OECD countries, a large proportion of more experienced teachers teach in less challenging schools compared to more challenging ones. So it's no surprise that children who are in predominantly challenging environments don't do well, because they are not being taught by teachers who have experience. Now, we should look at the issue about experience, because There's also evidence that we have to be clear about what kind of experience we are talking about. It's not simply that you have a lot of teaching experience in the classroom necessarily makes you better to teach children from different backgrounds. But experience is important. And more so in Belgium, when we look at the data, that more experienced teachers teach in less challenging schools compared to more challenging ones. So I think the question is, what does this present? What does this do? I think one is to say, a policy response is to say, ensure that, like I said, more experienced teachers also are posted or are encouraged or enticed to work in disadvantaged schools. But I think there are challenges to that. And what I'll be proposing is something different, which I think is a much more effective way of addressing the problem. And I would really like to hear your response to the proposals that I've put forward. So just to recap what I've been saying, that students from disadvantaged backgrounds in many developing and developed countries have made the least progress in learning outcomes. There's no doubt about that. While when systems or countries have invested in the education systems, it's often been to the benefit of the children from advantaged backgrounds. And it's understandable because they have more social capital and economic capital, and they are able to leverage that to take advantage of reforms and interventions that are introduced. But I think that if you look at the PISA data as an indication of what's going on, one of the things you see is that students from poor immigrant backgrounds lag behind their native counterparts, even though they attend schools staffed by trained teachers. In the global south, the problem is often constructed this way, that the disadvantaged and poor students don't have access to trained teachers. The assumption is that if you have a trained teacher, you would do well. You would overcome your disadvantage. Well, it doesn't turn out to be very true in other places. In many in many societies in Europe, these are children who are taught by trained teachers. Okay? So it seems to me that even though they have trained teachers, the trained teachers are not able to make a difference. Okay? And that's why we should ask ourselves, what kind of training are we giving our teachers? And I don't know, as teacher educators or institutions that train teachers, whether we go out and find out what our products are doing. I don't know whether you have that in Belgium. But in many systems, once the teachers have been trained and they've received the certification, they've been approved, we wave them goodbye, and that's it. I always ask that question. Do we know what effect our products are making? What changes they are making? Because that's the best way to evaluate our own programs. To be able to say, well, actually our training is effective because it's addressing a need. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times we are not looking back. We are not looking forward to see what is happening to our trained teachers, to see whether they are making a difference, and to use their feedback to inform our training. So I would like to hear from you whether you have something like that. What feedback do you get from your teachers in schools about the effectiveness of the training, about the challenges they face, and how do you use that information to address your own programs to ensure that teachers are much more effective? I would like to now turn my attention to some of the analysis that I did just before I came, just to highlight a few things. One of the things that you see very clearly from this too, I mean, this is the story of Austria and Sweden, is to look at, if you look at taking into account the differences between the poorest and the richest in terms of their socioeconomic background. And the PISA analysis uses an index of family wealth, index of home educational resources, index of professions related to classical culture in the family home. So this is a measure of the social economic capital that the children bring into the classroom. And if you look at the data, you can see that there is a consistent gap, even as the migrant population improves its wealth, okay, becomes richer. It doesn't necessarily close the gap. But I think what is also quite significant about this is that there's a very high variability in achievement among migrant students than among native students. So you can see, if you look at the plot, that variation, that variability continues right through, whether you are from the poorest or from the richest. So if you do well in the European society, yes, you improve, but you don't catch up. Even when you are of the kind of background that is equivalent to somebody who is a native. So this gap persists right through. And the question that we should be asking is, why does this happen? Why is it that these children still continue to underperform? But why is that we are not closing the gap? So there are two things. We want to close the gap between migrant populations and the native, but also we want to reduce the variability. If our teaching is being effective, these two things should happen. But unfortunately, it doesn't. When you compare with other countries, I think the picture is sometimes slightly different. It's important for us to look at what other countries are doing, perhaps, to see why they're having more success than others. And I think it would be an exercise that in future will be worth exploring, whether there are policies and practices in other countries that are responding better to the challenge than Belgium is. And if you look at the data, the gap among the poorest is smaller in Germany than other European countries. But the story is not very different. Actually, if you look at what in maths, you can see that the gap widens as you get along. So, you know, it's not making a much of a difference. Britain is a very interesting, there's a different scenario there. But because in the UK, it does seem that it's this economic, social, cultural status which drives inequality more than migration. Because you can see an overlap. If you look at the second quintile and the third quintile, you can see that some of the poorest or people from ethnic backgrounds in the first and second generation are actually doing as well as natives and outperforming them, although the average is still below that for the natives. And there's a slight closing of the gap as you go along. So I think in the UK, there is something that is different, which perhaps explains why this happens, even though it still has a long way to go to ensure that you close the gap. I think what concerns me is that the variation in performance doesn't seem to change very much as you move along, and it persists. And I think this is where we need to ask ourselves the question that why is this continuing to happen? Sorry. Now, if you look at Belgium, one of the things I would just want to point out in the case of Belgium is that the first generation immigrant and the second generation immigrant actually doesn't make much of a difference. The gap still persists even with the second generation immigrants. And I think there are indications that even with the third, there is still that gap. So there's the issue that somehow children from this background are not being served very well. And the story is the same. As I said, you can see that the differences in terms of the variability in performance persist. And I think there's a lot of what I think you can explain by those children who are coming from households that are economically much better is the contribution that perhaps the household is making from the social economic background of the parents. And I suspect that the school is making very little difference. A lot of that improvement you're seeing perhaps is coming from elsewhere and not from the school. And I think partly the story is that we haven't learned how to deal with the problem. Our training hasn't responded to it. And there are things that we try to do, but I think you're looking at really significant change in the training system, but also in the way teachers respond to this kind of challenge. France is an interesting, I put this one here because, again, you see that there's a difference here. In France, you see that the poorest second-generation migrants do better than the poorest natives. So, but as you move along, that changes. There's something interesting that happens with the poorest. The poorest natives and the poorest second generation seem to be in the same, but as you get along, as you become a little richer, that difference is reversed. I mean, it takes me back to the issue I posed at the beginning. I think there's enough evidence, as these two study references give you a lot of evidence, when they surveyed teachers in Europe. And the finding, the general finding was that they felt that their preparation was inadequate to deal with ethnically diverse classes. Now, what does that mean? These are teachers who have been trained pedagogically. So what are they talking about? What is it that these teachers are saying in terms of their preparation to teach ethnically diverse classes? What does it actually mean to do that? And I think that it's an indictment on in the way in which our teacher education systems have responded to the challenge. And when I've looked at some of the policies and programs in Europe, you can see that there is an attempt, there's a serious attempt. I think this is not to deny the fact that systems are trying to respond to this. But my view is that those responses are not enough. They do not go deep enough, and they would not tackle the problem in the way in which I see it. So I pose this question: how should teacher education respond? How should we respond to this? And I would like to submit that we should refrain from programs that are specialized, that treat this group as a specialized group, that give teachers with certain expertise. This is how you deal with disadvantage. So you do a couple of courses, you are introduced to some certain things, and that solves the problem. Because I think the problem is much more embedded in the school system. Now, you don't have to be teaching an ethnically diverse school to be confronted with the problem. You could be teaching a school which is in an advantaged area, but has poor children from different backgrounds. And so the problem is not simply a problem of the migrant, but it's a problem that runs across society. And I think that when we talk about better prepared teachers, often the emphasis is on subject knowledge and pedagogical knowledge. Okay, let's make sure teachers have better pedagogy, have better subject knowledge. But like I said, the teachers who teach these children are trained. They have been trained well by our system, and yet they are not able to make that difference, that much of a difference. Well, what I've proposed in one of my writings is to suggest that we need a comprehensive approach. We need a vision of learning to teach which is aimed at closing this gap. When you come into teacher education, to training, you should be confronted the first day with this problem. You should be confronted with the problem of the environment in which you're going to teach. And the problem that confronts the education system is the problem of disadvantage. But not very often this is not mentioned, or it's something that is given attention here and there. When you talk to teachers, they will say, well, if we teach well, these children should learn. And what that means is that if we have the skills and the techniques to teach well, they should learn. And I think that's a response, I'm afraid, that would not help the vulnerable and disadvantaged child. One of my colleagues, a team of researchers in Sussex, did a systematic review, but focusing much more on the global south. And they looked at the evidence. So they looked at the evidence about what really helps disadvantaged children. And they came out with this conclusion, which I think is really relevant to what we are talking about. That teachers who are able to pay sustained and inclusive attention and in environments where, excuse me, in which the children feel safe and draw on their backgrounds in the pedagogical discourse are those who succeed, are those who are able to maximize their learning potential. I think schools can be alien places for many children, especially from poor backgrounds. Okay? When you move from a poor background, where you have your social and economic capital is not that high, and you move into a school which has a completely different culture, that can be a space which is alien. When the school system and the teachers cannot understand you, cannot respond to you, misinterpret your behavior to mean aggression or to mean the other, that is an anomaly, then I think you have schooling environments that are quite alien. And sometimes we don't realize that a lot of disadvantaged children find schooling very, very intimidating. Okay? The culture of the school is intimidating. And then they're confronted with a teacher who is also not prepared to deal with their problems and their challenges. But the good news is that when teachers actually pay attention to that, create a safe environment for learners, actually they are able to respond well. But they respond in a way which impacts on the teacher's own strategies for teaching, their own pedagogy. That's key, that the teachers themselves are able to then make the necessary adjustment and response to those needs. And I would later on be talking about some of the strategies that I've from research, but also from my own work, which I think demonstrates that we can actually do that. I think expectations matter. The expectations that teachers have about students or learners is very important. It goes to the heart of whether teachers will make the effort or not. But it creates another challenge. How do we, as teacher educators, raise teachers' expectations of every child? And I think we have to look at our programs. I think we need to scrutinize our programs and see what elements in our programs are actually helping teachers to believe that they can help every child to succeed. In many of the work that we've done in Africa, when we've asked teachers about why children are not learning, often the blame has been put on the child. They are either not attentive, they have difficult backgrounds. Nobody questions their methods. It's the child. And if a child is being disruptive, that's why they are not learning. And in England, I've seen this made time and again, where teachers have very low expectations of children who come from a different culture. And here I have a personal experience because I've moved from Ghana to work in England, and my children, I had to find schools for my children. And I engaged a lot with the schools where my children were attending school. And I realized that I always give this example of my son. I have two children. My son is very, very shy. And, you know, if you don't know him, you're thinking he's a bit something not right with him. So when he started school, I was called in and told that, oh, we think your child needs special attention. Needs to, because he doesn't, and this was about after 3 or 4 days in the school. And I said, okay, but don't you think he's come from a different environment, a different culture. He was just 4 years old, that you need to, you know, give him more time to, oh, no, but, you know, we think that that will really help him if we give him this attention. But unfortunately, or fortunately for me, unfortunately for them, or fortunately for me, I knew a lot more about the system and what they were talking about. And I said, oh, you know what, because once you have that tag, once you tag the disadvantage with that inability, it follows you through the system. That record follows you. And every teacher in the school treats you differently. And I said, why don't you give him a bit of time and see how he adjusts, and see if he still persists, then we can. And they were not very happy with that suggestion, but I insisted, and that's what happened. And in the end, he outperformed every child in his class and all his mates. And then I went back and said, you know, what do you think? So, well, we thought that but I think he has made the adjustment. That's how they put it. He has made the necessary adjustment. Partly because he has parents who are able to give him the support. So immediately, my wife and I thought, okay, we got to fill in the gap here. We have to do something. But imagine if you're a poor parent, a disadvantaged parent, who has to struggle to earn a living and is busy doing other things, your child has no chance with the system. The system will change the outlook, the opportunities that child has. And I think that's the sad story, because there were children who were native English children who ended up grade 6 and couldn't read. Their reading ability was at grade 3. And the school didn't really, which was a problem, but I thought it was a travesty. How can a child reach grade 6? I thought this was a problem that I saw in Africa, but some of them could not read. And because they had been neglected, they had been stigmatized, and the teachers hadn't responded to their needs. And I think the point I'm trying to also make is that there was a special teacher. And partly because the teachers may not feel that they have been trained sufficiently to deal with this kind of child. So there's a special teacher. So just imagine that you don't have that special teacher. I'm not saying the special teachers are not needed, but you can't have them all over, right through every school. So you may find that in some schools, children may not have the kind of attention that they need. So I think it's important. Because teachers who have low expectations of what children can achieve transmit that expectation, often through the tasks they give them. Okay? You feel, well, they are not, you need to lower the expectation, give them a task that they can handle. And do not challenge them sufficiently. And I think the argument is not that every child would achieve at the top level, but every child has a potential to be maximized. And our job is to ensure that we maximize that potential through our teaching. And I think that's very important. So what am I advocating? I'm advocating for an inclusive teacher education for all. That is ensuring that all teachers develop the capacities that help to maximize the learning opportunities and outcomes for all students. And that should not be seen as a specialism for some teachers. I think that's the point I'm making. So this has implications for how we train our teachers. It has implications for our teacher education program. We've got to maximize that potential. We've got to ensure that every teacher knows how to respond to disadvantage. And that has a huge implication for the way we train the teachers. One of the insights that has emerged from some of my recent research in Ghana, but also in other countries that we've been researching, looking at teacher preparation. In Africa, the story is very depressing. Those of us who work on education in Africa, I have been working on this from the late 80s. And I always tell myself, and when I talk to development partners, I talk to DFID, USAID, UNICEF, I said, nothing has changed. Currently, you have a lot of tests. You have EGMA testing children and telling the whole world that children cannot read. And I said, I'm a bit tired with that, because it's as if it's like going to the doctors and always being told that you're not well and not being prescribed something that will deal with the problem. And the research is consistently saying that the children are not learning. And what's the response? The response is to improve teachers, make them better. And what does that mean? It means to ensure that untrained teachers become trained, get more qualification. I think we are finding increasingly that we've got to go further, deeper. And we are beginning to see that teacher educators are critical to this whole issue. I think that when we have worked with teacher educators, the assumptions they have, and I think it's important, as teacher, I don't know how many of you are teacher educators here, but how well do you know the schools in which your students are going to teach? What is the knowledge that the skills that you are presenting and you are helping your teachers to acquire? Because that's the authoritative knowledge and skills. That's what represents the professional skills. Well, are you sure that a lot of what you know and what you are trying to project is exactly what teachers who have been working in these environments and trying to do what they can do are also believing? I think there is knowledge that is out there, practical knowledge, that needs to be part of how we respond to this problem. So I would like to know whether in your system, for example, whether you are working very closely with teachers who work in disadvantaged areas, giving them an opportunity to be part of the training process, sharing their knowledge, and engaging with critical research and discourse about the issues. Okay? It's very easy to think that we know the problem and how to solve it. But there are teachers who work with disadvantaged children. There are teachers who are confronted with this problem. But there are also teachers who have been very successful in addressing this problem. And I think we need to see whether we can bring them into partnership. And I think teacher educators need to work to rethink their own pedagogy, to rethink their own strategy. And I had that experience. Yesterday I was sharing that with some people, and I said, I've been a teacher educator in mathematics, training teachers, and until I went with my teachers to do a demonstration, and they said, oh, why don't you go into a school? We went to a school, and I was going to observe them and then tell them what was right and wrong, until I was asked to do it myself. And all of a sudden I realized I've actually not worked with children that much. And I'd worked with young adults, young children of around 15 to 70, but these were 6, 7 year old. And this was a class of about 60 children, and I just fell apart, to put it bluntly, because I just didn't know how to. I knew what I knew I had to do, but somehow I could not organize myself in a way which ensures that the children learn. But we later on observed some teachers who were very good at doing that. And so what I'm saying is that there is expertise out there, and I think teacher educators need to work in tandem with experienced teachers to think about what it is that they can contribute to. So I'd like to spend a bit more time to talk about what I think are what I've called a 10-point strategy. And this is drawing a lot from my own research. You don't have that in your handout. This is further reflections as I was thinking about giving you something much more concrete than a lecture, so that when we have a discussion, we can go back to some of these things. Because the evidence suggests that these are some of the things that seem to work when we are working with disadvantaged groups and how we can actually address this problem. And the first that I would like us to think about is the capacity to diagnose learning problems of disadvantaged students. I think the ability of teachers to really get to the bottom of what the problems of learners are is crucial. I don't know whether in our training we have that embedded in the program, in our curriculum. How do you diagnose problems of people from disadvantaged backgrounds? Now, the learning problems they have may not be simply because they are disadvantaged, okay? Because, it's not because they can't understand the maths, okay? There may be things that are interfering with that learning. How are we able to find out, to actually decipher what's going on? And how do we socially organize the classroom in a way which allows children to overcome this disadvantage? So teaching is really about diagnosis, about ability to really engage with this. I think the second thing what we've got to do is to provide opportunity for all teachers to learn to teach in disadvantaged schools. Okay? You can get a lecture, like I'm doing, or you can get a story, but there's nothing like the real thing. And I think that we've got to think about how you get your teachers to work in disadvantaged schools as part of their training, and to pick up some things that will help them to understand the kind of things we are talking about, and to bring that knowledge back into the training program. So what I'm suggesting is that the content of teacher education, the content of what your students learn, should be based on the experiences they have in disadvantaged environments. So they go in there, do the research, they do have experience there, and bring that into the college context and have opportunity to discuss and engage with it and respond to it adequately. I think that's important. But I also think we need to start developing professional learning communities that can share the knowledge and experience of teaching. Because there isn't a one-size-fits-all, solution. What's the wealth of knowledge in Belgium about disadvantage and how teachers are responding to that? What's the dialogue? Is there a dialogue taking place within institutions that are training teachers, outside that, or it's something that is relegated into the background? Because there is a wealth of knowledge that is out there, and I think we need to begin to think about how we create these learning communities where we are talking about it, where we are discussing what works and what the challenges are. I think that's very, very important. The fourth point is critical. One of the things that we've noticed when we looked at the case of Finland is how teachers actually develop capacity to be researchers, the teacher as a researcher. And we have introduced some of these elements in our teacher education program where we want our teacher educators to be researchers. Now, researchers not in the formal sense of doing research and publishing a paper, but actually have a mindset that allows them to research their practice. And we know in the medical profession that happens. Doctors research their practice. They research what is going on. They take notes. They do experiments and find out a bit more. It's curious that we don't emphasize that sufficiently in teaching as a profession. You know, that we should make deliberate effort to research, to give teachers the skills to be able to begin to say, okay, I'm going to do a bit of research, look at this problem, and see what works and what doesn't work. Because we have to be very careful that we don't promote a set of strategies that we think, oh, here we are, we know what works. But we have to know what works and what doesn't work. But more importantly, we have to be able to explain why. Because it's very important that if we don't explain why, it's very easy for us to, you know, pass around these things which work and uncritically introduce them into places where they will not make a difference. So we've got to explain why is it that in this particular school, in this particular set of that teachers who are doing this particular thing are actually closing the gap, are actually making a difference. What is working and why? And I don't know, I hope that we would, you know, from the feedback, you'll be able to tell me from your own experience what works and what doesn't work. Well, if you know what works, what doesn't, how have you shared that? But the point I'm making about using action research, that it has to be embedded in the way in which we train teachers. So teachers collect data of their practice. They reflect. Communities in the schools talk about their research. Say, okay, let's try a little experiment here and see how we can respond to this challenge in the school. I think that's very, very important. The fifth point is to promote inclusive pedagogy. And this is very important because we don't realize that sometimes some of our practices actually alien or alienate some social groups and the way in which learners express themselves. So we should ask ourselves, are we promoting inclusive pedagogy? Are we training teachers to acquire pedagogies or practices or approaches that take account of difference, that is able to respond to different contexts and settings? And if we are, what is it in the curriculum? What can we pinpoint to us? This is it. This is what is happening. The sixth point is critical also, because I think we need to create more choice. More choice for how students learn and represent what they learn. Okay, because I think that allows children to emerge, to kind of come out with their own ways in which they can express themselves, ways in which they can dialogue and engage. One of the research we've been doing in Ethiopia, which has looked at disadvantaged children who dropped out of school, who the school system failed, but who have developed very, very high-level abilities to learn, came about because the choices that they were given to express their learning was expanded. So in this particular case, these children were given opportunity to represent what the curriculum was saying in forms that they can identify with, okay? And that process of re-representation allowed them to develop a capacity to really demonstrate their ability to learn. So in this research, we saw teachers teach, and then the students had to work in different groups. They had a drama group, they had a play group, they had a music group, and if it was mathematics, they tried to re-represent it. And then they had times where they dialogued among themselves to verbalize it, to engage with it, and to share it. And the students came up with very, very exciting ideas. And they were comfortable in doing that. So sometimes there may be difficulties of ways, where some people may not be able to express themselves in a certain way, partly because perhaps they lack the language ability. They are not able to express themselves well in the language. And it's very easy. I mean, that's the very interesting thing about language. If somebody cannot express themselves very well in a language, it's very easy for you to assume that they are not very articulate or clever. And that language becomes a barrier to what they can do. And it becomes much more challenging teaching such a child. And I am always sensitive to the idea that if my students can't get across what I'm teaching them, then I have to be very careful that the language is not an issue. I teach a lot of Japanese, Chinese students, and they come from a culture which is very different. And in my seminars, they are supposed to work in groups. So we put them in groups. And the English and American students are frustrated to death because these people will not say anything. They will sit there and they will not contribute. As this, they won't contribute. And then we've been trained to try and get them to contribute. So they have to fit in with the way we do things. And we get very frustrated. Well, sometimes when you look at what they produce, it's very, very good stuff they produce. Often not in the best language. But it's a way, and I always say, well, let's find a middle way. How can we understand where they've come from and use where they've come from to help them to work in ways which is non-threatening? Because asking them to speak, to engage, is very threatening for them because of the environment they've come from. And so it's very typical of them when we finish the lecture, the class, as soon as I walk out, they follow me and they want to ask questions privately, okay, because they don't want to be embarrassed. So I said, but why didn't you ask that question in the class? And they said, oh, no. And they ask very good questions. So the challenge I have as a teacher is to get them to talk, okay? It's not an easy thing, but I think I have to be very careful that I do not presume that because they are not participating in the way that I think they should, that means they are not very good. I think we use a lot of group work in schools, and we need to be able to think about ways in which we can organize groups that allow children from different diverse backgrounds to work together. It can be very frustrating, but that's what society is. I mean, if we're training these children to work in society, to live in society, that's the norm. That's the new norm. The new norm in European society is a mixed population. It's people from different backgrounds and experiences. So I think that doing that, I think for those who are advantaged, we begin suddenly to realize that actually some of these people who are coming from different backgrounds actually have very, very important contributions to make that will boost their confidence. And of course, you have to organize the group work in a way which allows them to be able to express themselves, okay? Do things in a way that gives them confidence and does not see that as a disadvantage. I think that's very, very important. The 8th point is about teaching as problem solving. Now, this is very dear to my heart because I think that you can go through teacher education, and we've had that in Africa, where a lot of our teacher education is not about seeing teaching as problem solving, but seeing teaching as acquiring a set of skills and this and that you go and just implement. Okay, being equipped with certain things that you go and do. And because of that, our teachers have not developed the capacity to identify problems or diagnose problems and tackle them. They are not problem solvers. And that's the question I want to ask also. Our teachers are training, making us into problem solvers. Because when we make teaching an activity which is about solving problems, I think we would then develop the capacity to respond adequately. Teachers do not dismiss the problem, okay? They do not see deficits. You don't have the basic capital for me to engage with. And therefore, you are a deficit. You are in the deficit. But actually, that's the challenge for me, to respond. It's how successful am I in trying to alter my methods, you know? So sometimes in my own teaching, I don't know whether you do that. When I get my students to evaluate and they write their comments and I'm thinking, I don't think there's something that I need to do differently. I'm not getting across. I don't think they understood this very well. What should I do? One of the things I do in my class these days is to use a lot of social media. I use YouTube a lot. And I teach undergraduate students development, and many of them don't have any clue about development. And they are not particularly interested. They come from different departments, and maybe they think, well, what else can I do? Okay, this looks like an interesting course. I'll take it and go and sit there and pass the time. But I know they are very keen on social media. And so I take the world outside and bring that into the lecture hall. So we spend a lot of time watching videos and getting them to have debates. And it's amazing that you have the students from different, and then the issues that they are confronted with is really before them, and the engagement is critical. So we have debates. I set up opportunity for them to debate in the class. So just next week, we're just going to have a debate, and I give them tasks to do, and then they come and talk about it. So I think, this is trying to make the subject interesting, to engage. So how are we using technology, for example? We know that technology, whether you're disadvantaged, people really pick onto it. Are we making use of technology to address the different learning needs? So I think it's important that we present teaching as problem solving. It would be good to see what that means in your curriculum. Many of the curriculum I've seen in teacher education doesn't present teaching as problem solving activity. It is not research based. It is not investigative. And I think that's a problem. And finally, there are two more points that I would like to present to you. I think we need to capitalize on diversity. It's important. Diversity is important. It is not a problem. It is not the problem. It is the solution. But if we take that approach, then it has huge implications for how we reorganize our training. Because we would not treat it as something that it's a problem out there. We've got to respond to it. We've got to address this, and then we have to go on some courses to be able to address this. But actually, we can see that as an opportunity to learn it, to enrich the learning experience. I think we need to do by using cases and examples that value difference. We are different, even when we come from socially economic backgrounds, rich backgrounds. We are still very different. And I think that we need to ask ourselves how much of our teacher education is capitalizing on diversity. How much do we know about the diverse population or groups within Belgian school systems? How do we capitalize on that? But there will be resistance. I think you've got to realize that diversity creates sometimes insecurity. The teachers themselves, it adds additional pressures on teachers. The other that you do not know often can be seen as a threat, can be uncomfortable. So it is one thing to say we have to capitalize on diversity. It's another thing to say, how do you actually do it? And I think this is what we need to be thinking about. How can we make diversity an important part of how we teach? See, because I think the teachers who teach are not only confronted with the curriculum. The curriculum often, in terms of the books and the materials, are often written not in line with some of the things I'm talking about. Okay, so the teacher has to take what is given as the school curriculum and find ways to present what is there in ways which celebrates, encourages diversity. And that's where we release the potential, I think, in children to be able to achieve. Western society and education is I think it's very, focuses very much on individuality. The individual. It's very much celebrated. And for me, being an outsider, it strikes me as interesting. And when you watch TV, anything, if you come, everybody's into who comes first. Everybody forgets whatever happens to second and third. I always tell people that my university in development studies, we are ranked #1 in the world, and we are always ahead of, in 2 years running, we've been ahead of Harvard. And somebody asked me who was third, and I can't remember, because once you know who is first, everybody is discounted. But I think we need to rethink this, that sometimes collectivity is important, and we need to create opportunities that celebrate that. One of the practices that I have used when I was a teacher was to organize my teaching that gives some of the responsibility for learning to my students, to work together to solve problems and present the problems collectively. And it's interesting when I do that, because I tell the students that I'm now going to grade you according to the presentation that you make. So if your presentation is not good enough, it reflects everybody in the group. And the first reaction that students say, well, that's not very fair. Well, I said, well, what do you have to do about it? Because some of them said, well, some of the members in our group didn't contribute much to the exercise. And I said, okay, so what did you do about it? That's problem solving. How do you respond to that? Maybe you make them present. You tell them, okay, you will do most of the presentation. Okay, then they will have to sit and contribute. But they are much more comfortable with individual work, much more comfortable. When in the real world of work, actually we don't work like that. You don't go and you have to talk to people. You have to talk to difficult people, work with people who are not very cooperative, quite disruptive. So I think that collectivity is very important. But sometimes people come from cultures where collectivity, engagement, especially African cultures, is very much community-based. And children who come from backgrounds where they are isolated, where they have to perform on their own, where they cannot contribute in a group, can feel that threatened. Whereas children often from very rich and privileged background are very confident. They can express themselves, they can argue, they can, so it's not a problem. And this can create a disadvantage for those from vulnerable backgrounds. I've come out with these 10 points, and I'm sure there are more, from some of the research that I've looked at, which has looked at how to address this gap, but some of my own research. And I would like to use this, if you permit me, as the basis for our interaction, to think much more about what we need to do to address this problem. But let me conclude by making a few points. I think that there's a huge responsibility on our education system, and especially in Belgium, I think, for the school system to respond in a way which can address a problem which is out there. Business as usual would not work. Societies, actually, schools represent what our society is. If you find a very diverse and inequitable schooling system, actually it says a lot about your society. But if you find a school or education system that has success in addressing or trying to close that gap, it also says something about that society. And I think it comes back to us as teachers and as teacher educators to see learning to teach as not simply teaching so that teachers have skills so that they can impart that to. But a successful school system, education system, is a system that can respond to the need of the disadvantaged. I mean, the rich people can take care of themselves. They know how to work their way. They have the social economic capital. So if you're very successful with rich people, you are not very successful, actually. It is your ability to address disadvantage. Teacher education should be about addressing the gap that exists for children who have come from backgrounds where that social economic capital is lacking. And we have to be careful that we do not add to the problem, but we actually address it. And I would like to see, hopefully, in a couple of years' time, when we present PISA results, begin to see that something is happening, something is changing. If you look at countries like South Korea and Singapore, and those countries that are doing well, it's not by accident. Actually, if you look at the policies, they are doing things differently. But also the teacher education system, I had the opportunity to visit Finland and to talk to teacher educators, and I was really impressed with the way the teacher education system was engineered to address diversity. If you look at it closely, look what they were doing, it confronted the issue about diversity and actually produced teachers who were researchers, teachers who were engaged with ensuring that those who are at the bottom are being supported to do well. And that is why you can find that they tend to do well when it comes to these national assessments. I know I've been speaking for a long time, and sometimes that can get some of us a little bit sleepy. So I think I would like to end here, and I thank you very much for your attention.